Good afternoon. My name is Alejandro Baer. I'm the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota. And I'm pleased to welcome everyone, also on behalf of the Center for Jewish Studies, with whom we have partnered in the organization of this two-day program. The symposium is a result of a conversation between scholars, faculty, students, and staff, not only at the University of Minnesota campus, but also across the country. What are constructive ways we can better deal with anti-Semitism in anti-racist scholarship and practice? How has anti-Semitism and the Jewish experience been addressed in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives on our campus and in other universities? Our symposium, Antisemitism and Racism in a Moment of Reckoning, will engage directly with what has become a difficult yet vitally important debate, both on college campuses and in the larger society. We hope you can join us also for the second day of our symposium tomorrow, November 9th at 11:30 a.m. Central Time. We thank all invited speakers for their readiness to contribute their insights to an honest and fruitful conversation, and also many colleagues at the University of Minnesota who have been involved in the planning of this event. We also thank our co-sponsors, the History Department, the Religious Studies Program, and the Institute for Global Studies Seeking Racial Justice Collaborative Series. We are grateful for the support and participation of the College of Liberal Arts and the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Daniel Schroeter, Professor of History and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies.
Thank you, Alejandro. And I also want to welcome everyone to our symposium and to open the first session of our two-day conference. Our roundtable today will focus on the multifaceted historical, legal, and theoretical aspects of the intersection of anti-Semitism and racism. It's my great honor to introduce our distinguished panelists who will bring many and varied perspectives to the table. Professor Tony Michels is the George Ross Professor of American Jewish History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author of Fire in Their Hearts, Yiddish Socialists in New York. He's the editor of Jewish Radicals, a documentary history, and co-editor of the Cambridge History of Judaism, Volume 8, which is on the modern world, 1815 to 2000, and is the author of many other publications, essays, and reviews. Joshua Shaines is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and Director of the Arnold Center for Israel Studies at College of Charleston. He is author of Diaspora Nationalism and Jewish Identity in Habsburg Galicia. His research and publications and scholarly and popular outlets focus on modern Jewish politics, culture, religion, and anti-Semitism. Claudia Bruns is Professor of Historical Anthropology and Gender Studies at the Institute for Cultural History and Theory at Humboldt University, Berlin. Her research and many publications focus on European cultural history, history of sexuality, transnational interrelations between colonial racism and anti-Semitism, Holocaust memory, among many other subjects. Keith Kahn-Harris is a sociologist based in London. He's a senior lecturer at Leo Baeck College, an associate lecturer and honorary fellow at Birkbeck College, and project director of the European Jewish Research Archive at the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. His book, Strange Hate, Anti-Semitism, Racism, and the Limits of Diversity, was published in 2019. The roundtable will be moderated by Jonathan Judaken, the Spence Wilson Chair in Humanities and Professor of History at Rhodes College. He is the author of Jean-Paul Sartre and the Jewish Question, Antisemitism and the Politics of the French Intellectual, and has published widely on anti-Semitism, race and racism, and post-Holocaust French Jewish thought. Recently, he edited and introduced a roundtable in the American Historical Review on rethinking anti-Semitism, and is completing a book entitled Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism, Confronting Modernity and Modern Judeophobia. So I'd like to ask the participants and the public to please submit your questions and comments in writing to the Q&A, which we will respond to at the end of the roundtable discussion. It's now my pleasure to turn this over to Jonathan Judaken, who will begin the discussion with some introductory remarks. Jonathan, please.
Thank you, Daniel and Alejandro and all those involved for convening this important conversation. We're at an extraordinary moment in American history. One way to situate it is to think about two major trials happening simultaneously at the moment that many of us no doubt are following in the news and on social media. On the one hand, the trial of Ahmaud Arbery, and on the other hand, the trial of the organizers of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Two trials that are about the two guises of white supremacy in America. The kind of white supremacy that marches with tiki torches and chaunts, "The Jews will not replace us," and the kind of white supremacy that patrols neighborhoods and kills Black men while jogging. Over the next 2 days, we're going to be thinking and talking about anti-Semitism and racism in a moment of reckoning. Anti-Jewish and anti-Black racism are often split in how we think about them. But our goal here is to frame them together and also to think about why and how they become split. And the University of Minnesota is the perfect place to host this conversation because in an odd way, it's the epicenter of this moment of racial reckoning. George Floyd was, of course, killed in Minneapolis. Ilhan Omar is the US representative for Minnesota's 5th congressional district, one of the members of the so-called squad, and as a Muslim woman, and given her politics, one of the lightning rods for claims that the Democratic Party is slipping into certain forms of leftist anti-Semitism, especially in its attitudes towards Israel. To take a historical turn to this conversation, the research of Riv Ellen Prell about both anti-Black and anti-Jewish prejudice at University of Minnesota in the 1940s has recently appeared in the latest issue of American Jewish History. And I understand that a recent exhibit at the university that addressed this past included controversies about the naming of buildings that has been quite contentious on campus. But this conversation is hardly only localized in Minneapolis. It is, as Alejandro said, a global conversation. And one of the virtues of this panel is that we're going to consider these issues in a way that will allow us to think about them from both a European and an American perspective, and to consider some of the similarities, but also the differences between the two. We're going to begin with Tony Michels, reflecting on what is shared by segments of the right and the left in terms of their approach to anti-Semitism, and how this is indicative of a departure in American politics, given the longer history of leftist approaches to both racism and anti-Semitism that he will discuss. This thread will be picked up by Joshua Shanes, who will consider some of the parallels between historical anti-Black violence in the United States and anti-Jewish violence in Europe. He will then tack to discussing how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has often complicated these issues today, especially around notions of Jews and whiteness, but also in the reciprocal critique by Jews, especially Orthodox Jews, of the Black Lives Matter movement. From the United States, we will tack towards Europe, and more specifically Germany, where Claudia Bruns will give us a historical overview of the debates about colonial racism and anti-Semitism, which have often resulted in privileging concerns about anti-Semitism and marginalizing anti-Black or anti-Muslim racism, given the history of the Holocaust and the history of memorial culture in Germany. Then we will cross the pond and end with a presentation by Keith Kahn-Harris, who will address these issues from the perspective of the UK, exploring what he terms selective anti-racism. In other words, how our contemporary polarization facilitates picking and choosing those ethnic or religious groups we vilify as racist, or political groups that we vilify as racist or valorize for their anti-racism. In short, we have a wonderful array of perspectives that are going to help us to understand how racism and anti-Semitism are being debated in the UK, Germany, Israel, and the United States. Each of the presenters will talk for about 8 to 10 minutes. After that, I might well follow up with some questions. But as Daniel said, we really urge you to feed your questions into the Q&A. We are going to attempt to answer as many of them as possible, if not in the course of the roundtable itself, then at the very least by trying to respond to them in writing. So please do submit your questions through the Q&A. And without further ado, let's begin with Tony Michels.
Great, thank you, Jonathan and Daniel and Alejandro, both for the introductions and the invitations to join this panel today. It wasn't that long ago when I think this panel wouldn't have been organized. I don't think there would have been a felt need for it. During the 1990s, there was a widespread view that anti-Semitism had mostly disappeared and disappeared for good, at least in this country. And I remember as recently as 2008 and 2009, in the wake of the last recession, a widespread feeling that anti-Semitism was no longer relevant because it was said that nobody was blaming the Jews for the recession. This was, again, as recently as 2008, 2009. Now these predictions of the death of anti-Semitism seem to be painfully premature. How to make sense of this, how to explain the rise in anti-Semitism in recent years, how to explain it, how to make sense of it is difficult and unclear, and has sent many people scrambling. There seems to be three attitudes about this current wave of anti-Semitism. One is that it's just part of an ongoing historical cycle in which anti-Semitism rises and falls in a cyclical pattern. There are those who say that anti-Semitism actually isn't a problem, that it's really not too big of a deal. The Jews are making too much of it, and in making too much of it, they distract from other more pressing and real problems. And then there are those who say that this actually is a problem in and of itself. It's not an epiphenomenon or something marginal, but constitutes a problem and something perhaps a reflection of deep-seated problems in American society, culture, and politics itself. I have to say that I adhere to the third view. I think anti-Semitism is a real problem. I think it's and it's not clear to me exactly what to do about it at this point. But I'm convinced this is a problem with deep roots in American society and embedded in various structures of the country. The biggest problem, as I see it, is the growth of the far right, and especially the anti-Semitic or most vocal anti-Semitic elements of the far right. Far right is not new. It's been around for a long time. But at this moment, I think we see a few things that trouble me. One is that, one is the fact that it's grown. Two, that it seems to be heavily armed. And three, it's been able to seep into and in some ways set the agenda for elements in the mainstream, which is to say that there's been a seepage from what was previously kind of cordoned off as white supremacist extremist groups into more mainstream realms, and that includes the Democratic, forgive me, that includes the Republican Party. That's one of the more troubling aspects. We see not only a growth of the racist and anti-Semitic far right, but its movement into the mainstream. Previous barriers that might have kept this in check, such as a respect for evidence, rationality, reliance on the media or trust in the media, those sorts of values, democratic values of rationality have eroded. And I think it's played a big role in, and I'm not, obviously this isn't an original thought, but it's worth restating that institutions and values that previously may have served to keep anti-Semitism of the far right in check have been greatly weakened. We still need, I think, to figure out why the far right has had such longevity and why Jews play such an important role in the worldview of the far right. But that's something perhaps we can talk about. That's one point I want to make, is that the far right is larger, its views more accepted, and its propensity for violence, even deadly violence, is greater than at any time in the last 50 years. Something that is, I would say, fairly new and troubling is that anti-Semitism towards Jews, is, well, let me put it this way, that Jews can no longer rely on the left, and here I'm meaning really to the left of liberals, progressives, radicals, and so forth. They can't rely on radicals to be allies in the struggle against anti-Semitism. That was once true, I think, and certainly during the first half of the 20th century, when leftist organizations were pretty staunchly opposed to anti-Semitism. One thinks of the Communist Party during the 1930s and 1940s, but this is no longer the case in the 21st century. What I think we've seen in recent years is a tendency among people on the left, not by all means all people on the left or left organizations, but certainly prominent elements, visible elements in the left, to either ignore anti-Semitism, minimize it, or traffic in it, depending on the case. I would say among those who traffic in it, there is a tendency to mirror the language of the far right in terms of rhetoric, attitudes, and rhetorical, or let's say structures, in terms of structures of thought. You can see this in the way that people on the far right and the left tend to talk about Jews as inordinately powerful. The theme of Jewish power, the accusation of Jewish power, that Jews are extraordinarily powerful, and that power needs to be confronted in some way to achieve social justice, is something one sees on the right and on elements on the left. Another worrisome parallel is the way people on the right and the left accuse Jews of making false accusations of anti-Semitism to in some way gain, some way benefit themselves at the expense of others or the common good. So this charge of one hears Jews weaponize or politicize anti-Semitism for their own gain. And the third parallel, I would say, between those on the left and those on the right is a tendency to what I would call racialize Jews. By that I mean to classify Jews in one or another racial category for a punitive purpose. So on the far right, it is said that Jews are enemies of the white race and are conducting a war of extermination against whites to consolidate their power. On the left, you see a view that says people on the left tend to classify Jews as white without nuance or qualification, and say that this classification is important to check Jewish power. In both cases, there's a view that Jews have to be, again, classified for a disciplining purpose. For the right, it's to expose their nefarious power. For the left, it's, to use a different language, Jews need to decenter themselves. That's the ethical way it is said for Jews to deal with their power. They need to recognize their white privilege. They need to decenter themselves, which is to say remove their concerns about anti-Semitism from public discussion. And once that happens, and only once that happens, can Jews behave responsibly. In neither case is there a recognition of the ambiguity of Jews in the American society and the reality of anti-Semitism as a genuine and growing threat. I'll just say by way of closure that I think that this left-right parallel is troubling. It's historically fairly new, that the roots go back a ways, but it hasn't entered into public discussion until recent years, and it poses a real problem for those who want to deal with anti-Semitism. It raises the question of how to think about Jews in American society, how to classify them, how Jews should classify themselves, and who allies of the Jews might be in these very uncertain times. Thank you.
Josh, do you want to pick it up from there?
Yes, thank you. I wasn't sure if you wanted to segue. Thank you. Thanks, Tony. Those were very helpful comments. And thank you all for convening this important seminar together for the next couple of days. So I speak to you from Charleston, a few blocks, not only from the well-known massacre in 2015 of the AME Church, but also just a block away from there is sort of the center park of Charleston, where until last year, we had a Holocaust memorial that was built some decades ago, and overshadowing it, literally casting a shadow on it, was a massive statue of John C. Calhoun, which is on Calhoun Street, which is where the Holocaust Memorial exists. That statue was just taken down a year ago, but until that time, you have this combination which very much reflects and affects the way I think about this whole question of anti-Semitism and race, because you have Charleston, South Carolina, which was the most important hub for slavery and a very important spot in the history of the Civil War and Jim Crow and so on. And we were quite comfortable, we, the city, producing a Holocaust memorial some decades ago. There is yet really, they're just now beginning to make serious work on a museum of slavery or of African-American history in the city. And the statues of the Jim Crow era still mostly stand, although Jim Crow is taken down. And I think a lot about this when I think about the relationship of anti-Semitism and race. And I'm thinking now about two events, which I'm going to use to frame the 8 minutes or so that I'm allotted to begin with. One is, as Jonathan already mentioned, the Charlottesville trial happening right now, where they are many of the men who are leading the Unite the Right rally with the violent intent that they had and the chants of Jews will not replace us. The relationship of anti-Semitism to that right-wing racist movement. And I'm thinking also about an event that is an event because it was not an event. Some of you may have known a few days ago that former President Trump gave a radio interview in which he said, Israel, until a few years ago, Israel literally owned the Congress, and the Congress did its bidding. now I mention this because I know I'm speaking to many of you in Minneapolis, and I contrast that, and I'm thinking about that in terms of the kind of results we get when your own congresswoman says legitimate or problematic words to that effect, even hinting towards that effect. They seem to be a much larger story. And I'm thinking about that. So this is what I want to sort of frame the next 8 or so minutes that I have. And I'm going to start with the Charlottesville trial. Anti-Semitism, certainly going back to Europe, is deeply embedded in notions of race, to be sure. Ideas of white supremacy are deeply tied to the idea of Jews as the coordinating efforts to deracinate or miscegenate or undermine the racial purity of the nation. And we see this today in Charlottesville and in other places. And in this regard, you might, to a certain extent, America, I mean, I'm certainly against the notion of American exceptionalism. America is not exceptional in that regard. America is another Western nation that has its own issues. And moreover, I would say America isn't even exceptional in terms of the issue of ethnic nations. You know, normally we think of, broadly speaking, 2 kinds of national projects: a more liberal one, which is sort of a social contract. Everyone who lives here is part of the national social contract, and we don't care about your ancestry or your race or religion or things like that. And then you have the notion of an ethnic nation, the idea that the nation is like an organism, a body, and you can't either exit or enter it, which we associate certainly with fascism, but also with other forms of European nationalism. In many ways, America is also an ethnic nation, and it has been from the beginning. The notion of America as a white Protestant Anglo nation was at our founding, and I would point people to the work of Eric Kaufman to explore this more. And throughout all of our history, there's been this strand of ethnic nationalism that's expanded. There was reaction against the Irish Catholic immigration in the 1850s. The Know Nothing Party, the so-called American Party, resisted that, but eventually absorbed that party as being, those groups as being white. There was great resistance against Italian and Jews and Slavs in the early 1900s, which led to the stoppage of those immigrants. But eventually there was a notion of those groups becoming white as well, but not for African Americans. That has always been the other. That has always been the racial other. And in this regard, you know, certainly American Jews' whiteness is a very complicated subject. There's work by Eric Goldstein and many others have talked a lot about this, how Jews become white, how Jews reflect that whiteness. But in many fundamental ways, the story of Jews in America is fundamentally different, because the notion that the kind of anti-Semitism that we see through most of American history has not been closely tied to the kind of racist nationalism. It's not the story of racism in America. Anti-Semitism was not central to the story of racism in the early 1800s. It was not central necessarily in other times. And I worry about making it so. And I'm thinking about the ways anti-Semitism does relate to racism. You know, I wrote about the way the Tulsa massacre should be seen as a sort of pogrom. The subaltern group in America is by and large not Jews, but African Americans. And therefore, when you have a pogrom in Russia, meaning to say that the dominant ethno-national group, with the acquiescence or support of the police, commits this violence, this rage sense of violence against property or people of the subaltern Jewish group to vent their frustration for pillage or whatever the cause may be, we see the same phenomenon in Tulsa, we see it in Wilmington, North Carolina, and many in Chicago and many, many other places, in a way that doesn't quite parallel. They may parallel anti-Semitism in Europe, but not paralleling anti-Semitism for the most part in the United States. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we think about a positive way of paralleling racism and anti-Semitism, which is to say, and here I'm working on with the contributions of Mark Dollinger, the way Black power in the 1960s, people think of this as being something quite scary. There were certainly anti-Semitic remarks by many of its leaders, but Jews at the time actually played those down and took inspiration from the Black Power movement. And they tended to find it as a sort of shot in the arm for Jewish celebration of Jewish particularity, for Zionism, even as Black Power movement was often turned anti-Zionist. Jews took from this actually a celebration of Zionism and Jewish particularism. And even the idea of what's called Afro-pessimism, the idea that the growing notion among some African-American intellectuals that it was not simply laws that needed to change, but deeply structural problems of Western society that could not be fixed, that racism was fundamental and incurable. Jews take from that often the idea that anti-Semitism is fundamental and incurable. These weeks, if those of you who are following the synagogue Torah readings, we read the stories of Jacob and Esau. And there's a very, very famous Talmudic aphorism that Esau hates Jacob, meaning to say anti-Semitism is incurable, it's essential to non-Jews, and there's nothing you can do about it, which is essentially the notion in some ways of Afro-pessimism. And for this, Jews look not necessarily towards America per se, although in recent years they have done more so, but to the Holocaust and to Israel. And there they see the kind of pessimism that we are hated and there's nothing to do about it. The response must be simply to accept it and fight back. And this segues to sort of the last point I want to make before I hand the reins over, which is the issues of Israel. There's a debate going on today in American Jewish politics dealing with anti-Semitism between how to define anti-Semitism. And the two leading contenders are the so-called IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, the IRA definition, or working definition as it calls itself, of anti-Semitism, and the JDA, the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. And most people, these are sort of pedantic issues that are not so concerned. But if you look at the two definitions, it's fascinating. And I encourage everyone in the audience to do so, to Google the two terms and look up the definitions, which are not especially long. They're a page or two each. And what you notice is that everyone more or less agrees on anti-Semitism per se. Anti-Semitism, the idea, for example, of belief in a global Jewish conspiracy, that Jews are subverting the national interest for their own particular interests, that all these sorts of ideas of Jews fighting for global domination, Jews as a sort of a fifth column element, these sorts of things. Everyone agrees on these issues. The real rub comes from Israel. That's where it comes down to. How do we deal with criticism of Israel? And how do we deal with sensitive things like criticizing the way Jewish power is wielded in Israel? Because after all, Jewish power, as Professor Michels mentioned, is one of those tropes of anti-Semitism. And yet there is actually Jewish power in Israel, and is one not allowed to critique how it's wielded? And it seems to me that the real issue has to be whether or not Israel is being used as a stand-in for the Rothschilds, as a stand-in for Jewish power, as a stand-in for this global conspiracy, this supernatural global conspiracy, or whether it is a concern about the nature of the regime itself. And this has real-world consequences in the United States. It's not just theoretical, and I'll cite one example. I'm very interested right now in American Orthodoxy, and so I follow all of its strands, and one of them I follow is the so-called Open Orthodox movement led by Rabbi Avi Weiss, who is an amazing individual and very interesting person, and who has been at the forefront of a lot of progressive causes for American justice. For example, he flew down to Charleston moments after the massacre at the Amy Church to participate in the funerals, to comfort the mourners, and so on. But at the same time, because not the far left, but mainstream progressive thinking is going to be concerned with how power is wielded in Israel, with the ongoing occupation of the West Bank, with the settlement project, and so on. Because there is concern about lack of equality, it's not unexpected to see members of the left, and particularly African Americans, especially since the Black Lives Matter movement is born, to say we are very concerned with the lack of equality in Israel-Palestine. We are very concerned about Palestinian lives. To hear the expression Palestinian lives matter, which I myself have spoken, by the way, and therefore to come out against people like his own Congressman Bauman, or, for example, on the eve of the election in Georgia, Reverend Warnock. He was very concerned, Warnock, who has attended AIPAC conferences and been to Israel many times, but he expressed concern about Jewish hegemony between the river and the sea and the lack of Palestinian equality. And that was enough to say, we can't support this. I cannot endorse this candidate. He's anti-Semitic. He's in the league with David Duke. That was the claim that was made. And I find that very concerning. And I think we all have to think about what that means when you say, I am concerned about Reverend Warnock. And keep in mind, he was running against a woman with connections to the KKK. But I'm concerned about Reverend Warnock because of his views on Israel-Palestine, because of his views that suggest that Palestinians need to have equal power with Jews between the river and the sea. And this does not mean by any stretch that there is no anti-Semitism on the left. I would be ridiculous to say that. And obviously there is, as Professor Michels just pointed out to us, it's growing in many ways. And nor does it mean, by the way, that anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism can't be covers, rhetorical covers for anti-Semitism on the left. But it does mean, I think, that we need to, that the relationship with race in America needs to be very carefully attended to, as we're doing in this conference, that we need to think very carefully about how our demands for Jewish power and how they express in Israel, how that is defined in terms of anti-Semitism and how that might affect the cause of racial justice in America. These should not be antonyms at all. These should be broader coalitions. But it seems to me that the coalitions are broader when other areas of disagreement are laid aside. And that's a two-way street, but it does mean those things need to be laid aside. I was not following my time, but I think I'm at 8 to 10 minutes, so I'll pass the torch and look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you for sticking pretty close to the time, and Claudia, if you would pick it up from there.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. And I thought, well, talking about different racisms and their interrelations often provoke strong feelings. Histories of suffering and resistance from the unspoken background of the ones affected by racism, sometimes competing with each other for recognition. And others have a part in the history of white privilege, or the perpetrators, and are ashamed or interested in forgetting or neglecting on individual and collective level. Who speaks when and where and with what kind of background is of crucial importance for the respective approach to the topic, I think. And that's one of the reasons why so many fierce disputes arouse around this topic, even in academic contexts. I myself speak as a historian and someone whose own family roots go back in the Nazi era. My grandfather fought as a soldier in the Second World War, and my grandmother told me about eugenic killings she had seen herself. And yet there was also a silence about other atrocities of the Nazis. How unbelievable something like the Shoah was, I only realized for the first time by watching TV documentaries in the early 1980s. That shook me like so many others in Germany. I began to study history, focusing on anti-Semitism in the pre-Nazi time. And at that time, I nearly heard nothing about other racisms against Blacks, migrants, First Nations, Sinti and Roma, the biggest minority in Europe, neither in school nor in public. This began to struck me as I started to get interested in colonial history some 15 years ago. This disconnectedness of the two racisms reflects a division that has long characterized European research on racism. European racism has often been seen as taking two paradigmatic forms, that of colonial racism, which can be traced back to the history of slavery and imperial expansion, and that of anti-Semitism, the roots of which are localized in the Christian Middle Ages. These different forms of racisms have rarely been analyzed in the same perspective since then, although there are others for early theorists like Hannah Arendt and Du Bois and others who hinted at these connections on an early stage. But then Holocaust and post-colonial studies developed largely independently of each other. Especially in Germany, anti-Semitism was much more intensely debated than other racisms, for good reason. Even the greater attention to the Holocaust, which advanced the research on anti-Semitism, did not begin until the late 1970s. We should not forget. And this not due to academic research, but to a mini TV series titled Holocaust. It was the story of a Jewish German family facing the time of persecution and being confronted with the murderous machine of Auschwitz. It was this film that started for the first time a public debate on the NS atrocities and German guilt in the early 80s. 10 years later, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Holocaust remembrance became an integral part of the new German national identity and even shaped the European community. Today, Germany is considered as the country that has dealt with its crimes in a particularly self-critical way. This special culture of remembrance became a kind of model for remembering globally atrocities against humanity in past and present. Genocide studies emerged, and people affected by colonial violence began to fight worldwide to get more attention for their sufferings, while referring to the crimes of the Holocaust as a kind of master narrative. Nevertheless, Germany was not paying much attention to its own colonial history and related colonial racisms against Blacks, people of color, or First Nations. The fact that the first genocide of the century was perpetrated by Germans in a colonial context, the genocide against Herero and Nama in Namibia, Africa, was often neglected. The German government dismissed any responsibility for the genocide till 2015, and it took until this year that negotiations on reparations in the name of financial aid were started and an official apology was issued. If links between anti-Semitism and colonial racism were at all discussed in Germany, then again only with a focus on the framework of the Holocaust. According to Jürgen Zimmerer, the colonial genocide was an important source of ideas for the National Socialist mass murder of Jews, contributing to an ultimate breach of taboo. Others, as Jeffrey Herf, on the other hand, stated that radical anti-Semitism should not be compared with the anti-Black racism of slavery, because the aims, the intentions, and the structures in which perpetrators operated were completely different in each case. Paranoid will to destroy on the one hand, mere will to exploit on the other. End of quote. From a post-colonial perspective, such a privileging of certain motives, rationalities, and state structures was less convincing. Holocaust researchers, however, warned that the singularity of the National Socialist crimes should not be relativized, especially in the face of the rising anti-Semitism in Germany and Europe. The view that anti-Semitism is interconnected with other forms of racism is still highly disputed in the German public sphere today and led recently to a new kind of Historikerstreit. Nevertheless, a post-colonial turn in Holocaust studies is transnationally widely discussed, and even in Germany, the rising number of racist crimes at the vivid Black Lives Matter movement made it clear how important it is to recognize all racisms as problematic and include colonial racism in a culture of remembrance, as well as in an anti-racist politics. And I would add that we not only need a multi-directional memory of different genocides, but also need to rewrite the history of racism as entangled global history in a perspective of a longue durée. The history that focuses more on the interrelations of anti-Semitism and other racisms. Only then we see that the emergence of colonial racism was from the beginning interwoven with the long history of anti-Jewish resentment in the Middle Ages. I leave out some examples here. And the reverse is also true. Colonial racism also introduced new logics of justification in the 19th century, which became relevant for the transition from a more religiously based anti-Judaism to a racial anti-Semitism. And there may be a short example. The German political activist Wilhelm Marr is well known as the founding father of German racial anti-Semitism in the 19th century. A close reading of his travel accounts to America nonetheless reveals that it was his experience with racial segregation and slavery in the Americans that contributed greatly to his transformation from a religious anti-Judaist to a racial anti-Semite. And then he stated that Black blood, for example, could also be found within the Jewish body as a result of this experience. This very short example, but could be saying more on that. And I end with giving an example of the intertwined memories of slavery and the Holocaust by coming back to my filmic example I mentioned earlier. As for the American ABC series Rhodes, which depicted the history of enslavement through a Black family saga in the 1970s, was a big success that provided the decisive impetus for the production of the NBC series Holocaust, I mentioned earlier, and was so important for Germany's turn in the Holocaust remembrance politics. The fact that this series, the Jewish family was called white, impressively shows that their story was told as a mirror image of the Black protagonists in Rhodes, and that the story was symbolically remaining within the racist Black and white color scheme, although presumably in this case with the intention of attributing the privileged status of whiteness to Jews. An entangled history of othering might also serve as a starting point for cross-cultural alliances and a politics of recognition able to associate different forms of racism as closely connected. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. That was terrific. Keith, we turn now to you to round out the interventions.
I'm terribly sorry, but I'm having problems with my camera. Can you just give me 1 minute, please? Just wait 1 second, please. I'm really sorry I cannot start my video. I'm afraid you'll have to cope with the picture of me on there. I'm very embarrassed about this. It was working before.
Keith, it's no problem. We're all just talking heads in little boxes anyway, so now you're just a little more static talking head.
Okay, well, you can have to imagine my image speaking. Okay, so my starting point in my work on anti-Semitism has always been with Jews. I have a long research interest in Jewish community, Jewish politics, Jewish culture. And anti-Semitism, I always thought, wasn't actually about Jews. So whilst I was interested in it as a Jew, and maybe for other reasons too, it didn't seem to be part of my research, and I certainly didn't think I'd ever write a book about it. But my argument is that anti-Semitism has become about Jews in a way that was less the case before. In other words, that whilst anti-Semitism necessarily involves a picture of Jews, an image of Jews, a fantasy of Jews that does not accord with reality, it's become about Jews in the sense that Jews are today intimately involved in processes of both condemnation and indemnification of anti-Semitism. Jews are heavily involved with people who are accused of anti-Semitism, both intimately accusing them and both intimately defending them. And I'm very much influenced here by the experience of UK Jewry from the years from 2015 onwards. And that were the years that Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the British Labour Party until April last year. But I think the experiences that British Jewry had during the Corbyn years have a wider applicability and wider lessons, although not unproblematically transferable ones. And actually one of the things I want to talk about in the next few minutes is what we can learn and not learn from it. But the big picture is that Jews were in the forefront of British political controversy from 2015 as the British Labour Party was accused of anti-Semitism, and it became a central part of what were at best debates and at worst open conflict over the future of what the British Labour Party should be. Now, in my own work, I've developed a concept of selective anti-Semitism. I actually spell it anti-stroke Semitism to kind of indicate that this is a mixture of both anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism. The basis for developing this concept is that what I call consensus anti-Semitism has become rarer. That is anti-Semitism that rejects all Jews with almost no exceptions, and that there is a consensus amongst Jews that it actually is anti-Semitism. And this kind of anti-Semitism, I think, has become rarer, although it definitely still exists. Instead, the dominant form that anti-Semitism, or at least the most influential forms of contemporary anti-Semitism, are ones that differentiate between Jews, between what one could crudely say good Jews and bad Jews, those Jews who are acceptable and those Jews who are not. And inevitably, that distinction involves it ends up involving Jews in controversies about anti-Semitism. The preferred Jews often, but not always, end up defending the people being accused of anti-Semitism, and those who are treated as the bad Jews make the accusations. And all of this ends up creating arguments amongst Jews. Now, there are different left and right-wing versions of this, of course. On the left, it is often, certainly for someone like Jeremy Corbyn, the good Jew was definitely the anti-Zionist, socialist, secular heir of the Bundist tradition, and to some extent Haredi Jews as well. On the right, it tends to be, for someone like Viktor Orban, or in some quarters of the American right, it tends to be the right-wing pro-Israel version of the Jew. Now, this selectivity is part of a wider trend towards a selective anti-racism that can take a couple of two basic forms. One is a selectivity that one minority may be protected, whereas others are not, and vice versa. So Jews may be protected and seen as worthy of anti-racist solidarity, whereas Muslims, for example, are not, and of course, vice versa. Or the other kind of selectivity is the one I just talked about, where you select one segment of a minority over another section of the minority for either protection or for damnation. Now, why does selectivity emerge? Well, I have quite a lot to say about that, but just to give the headline, I think it emerges in part, at least, due to the widespread delegitimization of racism and anti-Semitism. But it's a kind of superficial delegitimization of racism and anti-Semitism, and the ability to speak openly of hatred for groups of racialized others. And I don't think racism or anti-Semitism, it's an open question whether racism or anti-Semitism is any greater or lesser in society generally, but certainly the language with which one can speak to it is much more difficult to achieve. And so selectivity provides a kind of get-out clause here that is extremely useful. So a lot of my experiences, as I say, are shaped by what has been going on in the UK for the last few years, but we can easily find American examples of it, particularly on the American right. So Jonathan suggested I mention this, but certainly a case in point would be last week's governorship election in Virginia, where the new governor Youngkin said immediately on taking office that he would adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, but he also ran on an anti-critical race theory platform. So on the one hand, he is acknowledging a particular kind of Jewish perception of what anti-Semitism is, and on the other hand, he is delegitimizing a particular definition of racism that was primarily developed by people of color. So how do we deal with selective anti-racism? And I'd like to first of all make a little aside here. When I posted that I was appearing on this panel on Facebook yesterday, an academic who I think is actually on this call pointed out to me that the panel mentions racism and anti-Semitism, yet the panelists do come from the anti-Semitism, the Jewish side of the fence here. The panel tomorrow is a little bit different. And I'm not necessarily condemning this, but it does show the difficulties in developing a praxis that deals with racism across the board. It raised the very complex question of how far anti-Semitism is a form of racism, or that can be subsumed into it, how far it's distinct. And it also raises issues of hierarchies of importance. But on thinking about my friend's comments, I do think there is at least one reason why it is worth, even if we're drawing conclusions about racism more generally, why actually it's important to put anti-Semitism in the spotlight, is that I think that some kinds of selective racism and anti-racism are much more advanced with regard to Jews than they are with other minorities. The kind of total racisms that delegitimize everybody in a particular group, other than perhaps a tiny minority, are much more common with regard to many other minorities, although not more ones. And I also think that I don't like the phrase Jews are the canary in the coal mine, but I certainly think that in some quarters the Jewish experience does highlight problems, particularly on the left, that have become more and more pressing. I would say in the UK context, for example, the presence of, in the current British government, of a number of British prominent right-wingers who are of South Asian Hindu descent is focusing your attention that you're starting to see on the left a similar discourse with Jews that distinguishes between the good ones, the good minorities who recognize their oppression and are part of anti-racist coalitions, and those who have been adopted by the right and therefore are the bad minorities. So I think that's one area where attention on how the process has advanced in the anti-Semitism case does at least help us anticipate problems that are starting to emerge in other areas. So in terms of how we condemn and fight selective anti-Semitism on both the left and the right, one of the things I argue in my book, and we don't have time to talk about here, is that a major task is that Jews need to refuse love, that fighting philo-Semitism is part of the major task in fighting anti-Semitism today. We can talk about that later. But I want to briefly focus on and argue that this isn't just because there are anti-Semitic traditions, selective or otherwise, on the left and the right. It doesn't mean that the Jewish centrist liberal tradition can unproblematically be the only route for Jews to combat anti-Semitism. For one thing, there is a left anti-Semitic tradition that is strong and still exists, and also liberalism itself can be selective too, just because Jews tend to hold more numerously to liberalism compared to other political ideologies, certainly in Britain and in the US, doesn't mean that liberalism can also select the Jews it likes. But I think a bigger problem is that, and I see this in the States and in the UK, but I think it takes different forms, is that there's a problem with Jewish liberalism's even-handed approach that equally, or sometimes not even equally, condemns left and right, as though left and right anti-Semitism were similar branches of an identical phenomenon. And that can sometimes lead to deliberately or otherwise ignoring imbalances of power and context. And that is how a comparative approach can help with this. I was very, very struck by how some US Jewish liberal intellectuals have drawn on the example of, have observed what happened in the UK in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn and applied it unproblematically to the US. When there are considerable differences in the balance of power, without acknowledging the huge power that the US right has at the moment and its increasing turn towards overt racism and overt fascism as a greater existential danger, in my view, than that provided by the left of the Democrat Party. I also think it can work in the other way, in the sense that I would be very struck how when the Jerusalem Declaration came out, which has been discussed before, advocates of IRA in the UK on the liberal end of the Jewish political spectrum were very, very hurt how some of the sort of left side of Jewish liberals in the US did not support IRA. So people like Michael Walzer were very criticized by UK Jewish intellectuals. And that ignored the fact that IRA in America has been promoted far more strongly on the right than in other parts of the spectrum. So there is a sense of flattening. And I think that is one of the things that I'm going to leave it on this, because I know I'm exceeding my time. There is a real problem in analyzing where power lies and where threat exists in an age of social media and online activity, because it can make all anti-Semitism seem equally powerful and omnipresent. And globalization also makes it easy to conflate everything into one seamless phenomenon. So it seems to be the role that academics and intellectuals and hopefully political leaders as well can play is to honor the empirical and to develop a contextual approach alive to the workings of power that takes seriously the differences between how issues of anti-Semitism and racism play out in different contexts at different times at different spaces. Sorry about the microphone again. Not microphone, the camera.
Well, thank you very much for that. I see that there are just a couple of questions that have been fed through into the Q&A. There's been a lot that's been put on the table in the course of these very short presentations. As folks who are listening think a little bit more about what it is that they might want to ask the panelists, I think I will just get started with trying to pull through a few of the threads that I heard about in the course of the presentation. And I guess I want to go back and if you can, I think it might be helpful actually if everybody puts on their video to the extent that they can now, so I can look each of you in the eyes. I want to go back and ask both Tony and Josh to talk a little bit more about the issue of the history of Jews and whiteness, and start there in terms of thinking about some of the issues that have been put on the table. How is it in each of your opinions, and we'll start with you, Tony, both of you raised this in the course of your discussions. How is it that you think the issue of whiteness and the history of whiteness in the United States and the particular role that Jews, the particular history that Jews have experienced vis-a-vis whiteness in the United States ends up impacting today on how we think about questions of anti-Semitism?
Well, I'd say that there's now a long history of Jews being treated as a distinct race, and by white supremacists as a hostile race, hostile to white people. That's one thing that actually differentiates Jews from the groups that have been mentioned in the discussion in the United States, meaning Italians, Irish, and so forth. Those groups did, to various degrees, face various kinds of bigotry, racism, xenophobia, and so forth. But that ceased to be the case for all those groups. There is no anti-Polish sentiment in America. There is no anti-Irish sentiment of any significance in this country. But anti-Semitism continues. And so in that sense, while it's absolutely true that Jews have never faced the extent and severity of racism against Blacks, no sane person would say otherwise. Jews have diverged from European immigrant groups in that they have faced anti-Semitism to greater or lesser degrees through this whole period. So it's important, first point I'd make, it's important to keep Jews in a comparative perspective along multiple points, not just Jews compared to African Americans, but Jews compared to the panoply of groups that have come to the United States. And you see when you do that, a high level of distinctiveness of Jews when it comes to questions of anti-Semitism and racism specifically. Now, the reason for this is that the far right has persistently viewed Jews, again, in racist terms. So in as much as the far right is growing and continues to be racist, white supremacist, and continues to be anti-Semitic in the way I'm describing, then there is an intersection between Jews and race. And and I would say, if we want to do something about racism in the United States, we have to see that without immediately slipping into a kind of simple-minded observation that blacks suffer racism worse than Jews suffer anti-Semitism. That's absolutely true. And yet, where does it lead us? Where does the observation lead us? If we organize white supremacy as a serious problem, then we have to take racialized anti-Semitism as a serious problem. So this is something that those who have spent the greatest amount of energy in theorizing have somehow failed to miss. And I think the reason for that, I just hazard a guess here and then stop talking, is that I think there's been a tendency of people, any number of reasonable people, not just leftists, but people from all over all over the reasonable political spectrum. I think there's a kind of thought process that says something like this, that white supremacists are ridiculous, that they don't, and therefore they don't have to be taken seriously. They might be dangerous in some regards, but their ideas are ridiculous. And so if they say that Jews are enemies of the white race, how can we take that seriously? Therefore, why bother any time on really thinking about what that means and what that means for how the white supremacists see the world and what it means for Jews within the larger racial matrix of the United States.
So before turning to you, Josh, and I do want to get you in on this, but Keith, can you just come back and talk a little bit about this from the perspective of selective anti-racism? Because one of the other things that characterizes the far right now is also their support for Israel and Israel as a kind of model of a certain kind of ethno-nationalist fortress state organized explicitly around anti-Arab or anti-Muslim racism that appeals to many on the far right. So that may be a useful way to get people to understand more of what you're talking about in terms of the idea of selective anti-racism. Do you want to say a few things before we turn to Josh to elaborate a little on Jews and whiteness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to distinguish several different sorts of quote unquote philo-Semitism on the right with regards to Israel. I think it plays out slightly differently within certain evangelical Christian and within the Christian right, which itself is not a seamless whole, and within the more what we would traditionally call the far right groups. But one of the things that I think we're seeing in America, and I don't think it's a discourse that's got enough attention. We saw particularly under Trump an increasing sense of disappointment with Jews who are liberal Zionists. And of course, liberal Zionism more or less is fairly normative outside of orthodoxy in America as it is in the UK and many other countries. So it's a kind of pro-Israelness that has a significant kick in the tail. And it's sometimes very explicit what that conditionality, that selectivity is. You saw, for example, related to this, Rudy Giuliani saying, I am a better Jew than George Soros is. You have something similar as well with Donald Trump saying, criticizing Jewish audiences for not being grateful enough, for not being pro-Israel enough. You also have attempts to make one of the things that it also does, and this was particularly clear under Netanyahu, although there's an element of continuity even under the current government, is that you had far-right regimes making common cause with Israel as part of trying to create an ethno-nationalist anti-Muslim bloc. And the key figure here is Viktor Orban in Hungary. And one of the things that saw is, and Netanyahu was fairly warm towards Orban. And so one of the things that does is that you have a situation where the Israeli right starts to turn its face against Jews in Hungary and elsewhere in Europe, who are talking with people like Orban with great concern. So one of the things it shows up is some of the tensions and cleavages between diaspora and Israel.
Thank you. That's really helpful in terms of filling this out. So, Josh, can we now turn back to you? And Tony made this really important point that one of the things that differentiates the elasticity of whiteness and the expansion and incorporation of groups who have suffered bias and prejudice and even discrimination in the United States and Jews is that they no longer suffer that. In terms of the comments that you made, what you brought to the table, can you talk a little bit more about Jews and whiteness and the ways in which you think this impacts the contemporary conversation?
Yeah, sure. So let me first of all say that I agree with pretty much everything Tony said, and it's very important points. Anti-Semitism is no surprise, is quite different than say anti-Italian or anti-Irish sentiment in American history in terms of whiteness. My emphasis would be a little different, and for very specific reasons that Keith brought up. I think the butt point about, of course, African Americans have been persecuted more. I don't think it's just an issue of quantitative difference. I think it's a qualitative difference, and I think that means something. I often ask my students at the end of the semester in modern Jewish history, their final question is America just another Western emancipated Jewish community like France, Germany, or England, or is there something exceptional about America? And if they've been listening to me and so on, they know what I feel, but I want them to explore it. And the one part of the answer they really have to give me is to explain that although anti-Semitism appears in America, and in the last few years, you can bet those answers have changed since, say, 15 years ago when I started teaching. But although it appears here, and it appears in racialized forms, it's a very important part of the racist right. But at the same time, Jews were not the quintessential other in America in ways that was formative to their identity and their success rate. And so that means, for example, that although there may have been notions of Jews not being white, and that had real consequences during some of the decades of American history in terms of social and economic opportunities, set aside the block of immigration, entrance to some universities, entrance to be able to live in some neighborhoods, some houses, and so on. But by and large, white Jews in America, I should say, have enjoyed the benefits of whiteness in critical ways. The issue of redlining, Jews maybe couldn't buy in certain neighborhoods, but they could buy, and they could develop generational wealth through home ownership, things like that. So it seems to me that I think that point, I personally anyway, take to be especially important. I think it has real world consequences. So for example, Keith's point about power, I think it's very important. The issue of where do we find the locus of anti-Semitism that's most concerning? I think you have to identify it with power. So I began my presentation talking about Trump and his comment that really got no press at all this week. Whereas when Congresswoman Omar says something similar, or even much less, literal, it's focused for 2 or 3 weeks as the top news. And, you could say it's because she's a woman of color and he's not. And maybe that's part of it. But I really think it has to do with the issue that Keith just mentioned now, which is about what it means to be pro-Israel. I think there's been a shift of anti-Semitism to mean anti-Israel in the sense of anti-Jewish supremacy or anti-Jewish hegemony, anti-Jewish power as being supreme power in between the river and the sea. And Netanyahu and even the present government in many ways and others have redefined anti-Semitism to mean that. And since Trump clearly does prefer Jewish power in the land of Israel and views Israel as a bastion against Islam, that can't be anti-Semitic. And so that's not problematic. I think that's really the issue at play here. And I'm concerned, by the way, when Jews say we're not white, I don't think they're doing it in the nuanced way that Tony certainly just was. I really think they're doing it in a way to suggest maybe if you push the shove, we haven't suffered as badly in America or something like that, but we are not white, we're discriminated against, and therefore that justifies Jewish power in Israel, that justifies calling anyone who questions that anti-Semitic, anyone who suggests that's a problem anti-Semitic. So that, from my perspective, that's my real concern with that language. I think that we do have to consider it in a nuanced way. We have to understand how Jews became white, how they never did, or how it was elastic and changing, and it depended on when and where and who. But at the same time, I think if we ignore the whiteness of Jews in terms of systems and power and socioeconomic growth, I think that the way that's used can be detrimental to the broader struggle against anti-Semitism, certainly, and against racism as well. You're still muted, Jonathan.
Thank you, sorry. Claudia, I want to bring you back into the conversation. I want to wind this back around. So in the course of your presentation, I think you made the strongest bid amongst all the presenters for what you were talking about in terms of an entangled history of othering and the ways in which that can lead to a politics of recognition, such that we don't end up having a competition of suffering, but rather a variegated and multi-directional approach to recognizing the history of marginalized and stigmatized groups. But I want to kind of talk about this specifically in relationship to some of the contemporary discussions around critical race theory. I know, for example, that in France, Emmanuel Macron has criticized critical race theory as being a divisive ideology that's been imported from the United States, even though his own criticism itself has been imported from the United States. This is some of the ways in which this debate around critical race theory has played out. Now, in Germany, it may not be critical race theory per se. It could be post-colonial theory or the history of colonialisms. But what is some of the ways in which these discussions are playing out in the public sphere in Germany at present?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I have to think about it. I mean, in recent times, post-colonial theory was getting more a voice, or was heard, was better heard. It got more space in public discussions, but it was only, I mean, it's not much. There were some people fighting for that, for more acceptance for discriminated persons for racial reasons, but we have still a really racist situation here where people are discriminated because they were not accepted as persons, but and even the society is not really accepting that we have a racial problem, that we have a problem with minorities that come from different countries with migration background, that they are confronted with racism. We have, at first to learn that, we have to admit that, we have to talk about it. And we start only recently to have Black actors in TV shows and so on. And we are really, I don't know, compared to United States, we have not reached what you have reached, that is accepted as a real problem and that we have to act upon it. We don't have anti-discrimination rules at university, for example, in this respect, in respect to migration, to race, anti-Black racism, for example. And so there's a really big gap. In the public sphere, when people raise these issues,
is there a backlash that argues that somehow this may end up occluding the history of anti-Semitism in Germany or occluding the history of the Holocaust? Isn't this part of what was at stake in the debates around Achille Mbembe's work or Dirk Moses? Is that the case in some of the ways that we're hearing in France or hearing from the right in the United States, that these issues are issues that perhaps shouldn't be spoken about or shouldn't be spoken about in the ways in which they are?
Yeah, of course, we have this historian dispute at the moment, about the question how to deal with the Holocaust. How can we talk about the Holocaust in relation to other genocides? And are there any other genocides comparable to Holocaust? And what does it mean? But I think, it's not, we should not end up comparing. We should draw better, we should listen to the people that are discriminated, and we should give them a voice. And that's really what the Black Lives Matter movement also in Germany tries to do, to give them a voice and to not to act against others, to act against Jews and so on, but to integrate different forms of discrimination and find ways to act against all of these racisms, because they are really feeding each other. Because someone who's against Muslims is also against Blacks and also against Jews. Basically here, I have the impression that people, that it's not, we shouldn't let people differentiate between different racisms, because they all fed each other and work towards each other, inspire each other, and but at the same time, it's also important, of course, in Germany to stick to the point that the Holocaust is something that is very, very important, that we should still treat with very much respect, and that is very important for our history to accept that we are the followers of the perpetrators, and that is also something very emotional for most people. So that's basically clashing here, that there are new groups coming up and raising their voices to be heard. I don't know if I made my point.
Just to follow from that, there are a whole number of questions that sort of revolve around this issue. And to put it in simple terms, the biggest question posed by Catherine Power is what is the relationship between Judeophobia as a distinct phenomenon and other racisms as a more general phenomenon? And then what are the ways in which these end up playing out in terms of memorial sites, in terms of the history of remembering? Josh, you kind of framed your presentation in terms of that issue with respect to the public park in downtown Charleston. But I wonder if each of you could speak briefly from your perspective about the ways in which what Keith has called selective anti-racism can be overcome in terms of simultaneously recognizing what is distinctive about differing forms of racisms and the ways in which they overlap and interpenetrate. And maybe we can just go in the order of the presentation. So Tony, can you start us off a little bit on that? And we're running a little bit short on time.
I'll be very quick. I'd say that any answer at this point has to be tentative, because I don't think enough historical and theoretical and sociological research is done to be able to answer that question definitively. But my gut reaction would be that the emphasis on Jewish power that I referred to before, I think, is probably the most distinctive aspect of racism towards Jews compared to others. I think it would be welcome for there to be more research on Jews and Asian Americans to get a better handle on this. But I'll go with the obsession with Jewish power, or should I say so-called Jewish power.
I would just similarly, but I'm thinking more about the myth of global Jewish power, of a nefarious and global Jewish power and conspiracy. I think those are the key elements to think about with Jews in anti-Semitism. Is thinking about how Jews are globally connected as a single organism, as a single ontological being, whether with a physical, literal conspiracy of Elders of Zion or George Soros or whoever it may be. That's the myth I'm looking for when I'm concerned about anti-Semitism. I think that particular manifestation of Jewish power is what I'm looking for when I'm looking to identify anti-Semitism.
But it also sounds like, from what you've said, there's a problem with this, and that is that on the one hand, there are these classic anti-Semitic tropes that emphasize global Jewish power. On the other hand, there are, evidence-based, data-driven, like concrete material reasons to think about the ways in which Jewish power has changed post-Holocaust. And that partly does present a little bit of a problem in any case.
Right. I mean, if we're talking about Jews, often it means we're talking about Israel to a certain extent. It comes back to that often, too often maybe. But yes, I mean, that's my concern about Jewish power as a trope per se, because Jews do have power collectively in Israel. And I don't know. So if one is talking about the way Jewish power is wielded outside of its borders, that concerns me very, very much. If one is talking about how Israel chooses to govern and the territory under its control, I wouldn't want that conflated into the same category at all. That's my only issue with the phrase itself, although I agree it's absolutely central to anti-Semitism.
Keith, did you want to say some things about this?
Yeah, I'd just like to raise an issue that I was wanting to raise, but I can fold it into the question you just asked. I think we need to think about privilege as revocable or as irrevocable, and assimilation as revocable and irrevocable. One of the books that has most informed me is a fairly obscure study of the Maltese minority in Britain that was published in the early 1970s. Now, the Maltese minority in Britain were the victims of racism, seen as not properly white and associated with pimping and white slavery. Within a couple of decades, they'd completely assimilated, and and that trope has absolutely zero cultural resonance in the UK anymore. Now, and I think we can that's an extreme case, admittedly, but I think it was Joshua who mentioned Polish Americans and Irish Americans, although I think there might be some spots, particularly about the Polish jokes and maybe the Irish stereotypes as well. I think it's broadly correct. It's very hard to envisage a time when anti-Polish or anti-Irish racism will burst out again in America. It is easy to understand because we are witnessing a time when anti-Semitism from a very low base suddenly bursts out in America. Now, that sense of cultural depth may be one of the things that distinguishes anti-Semitism. But then again, one might also see that cultural depth with other minorities, in the sense that even if there is a time when African Americans when racism against them in America it goes to a fairly insignificant level, one would also think that would be a similar kind of revocable privilege as well. And so I think that's one area where we should be thinking about what are the forms of racism that are so deep in the cultural bedrock, is that even when they are dormant, they can still burst out again.
Well, I am being told that we really do need to close the session at 1 o'clock on time, even though I know that there are a lot of questions that we haven't attended to. I apologize for not fulfilling my promise and not getting to everything. I don't know where the hour and a half went, but I'm going to turn it over now to Daniel Schrader to make some closing comments and to invite you to continue with this conversation tomorrow.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and all the panelists. And I think where the time went was there are just so many questions that emerge from this conversation. So I'd like to invite everyone, all the attendees, and of course our panelists, to join us tomorrow at 11:30 for another very closely related, important conversation on DEI and anti-Semitism on US campuses. So we hope to see you tomorrow, and yes, wish everyone a good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are located. Okay, see you tomorrow.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.